Hey there, so today we're going to be taking a look at the Tomb Raider Reboot series running without any graphics card. Now before we jump in and look at the game individually running, we are of course going to take a look at it running across all of the mini PCs that I own, just to see how wide of a performance gap there is between all the systems. And here we have the original game running at its ultra graphics settings. We didn't go with the ultimate graphics settings because we don't want TressFX. TressFX pretty much destroys performance across the board, and it's really unnecessary. But you can see here that with both of the models of the SRE5, we are at least for the most part getting an above 30 FPS average, but there is a noticeable gap between the 5560U and the 5600H. And there is also a noticeable performance jump going from the 5600H to the 6600H. RDNA 2 is really showing off that it actually has some pretty nice performance here, where we're getting very close to a 60 FPS average on this game right here at its ultra graphics settings. Now unfortunately the rest of the franchise is not going to be as great of a showing as this, but we can move over to Rise of the Tomb Raider just to even get you a 30 FPS average. This time around we are running the game at the medium graphics preset because of the fact that running it at anything close to the highest is just going to murder performance across the board. But you can see here that there is a very noticeable gap in between what is going on with the Ryzen 5 5560U and the 6600H. Now all of them seem to be struggling to even provide a 30 FPS average in a lot of sections, but the 6600H is keeping up a fair bit better, with both of the SER5 mini PCs struggling to even get close to 30 FPS. Now the 5560U is really going to require you to drop the resolution down. You can get away with the full 1080p resolution on the 5600H if you're willing to go with the lowest in-game graphics settings, but it's really just the 6600H that can actually keep up with a medium graphics preset and a 30 FPS average at 1080p. Now for Shadow of the Tomb Raider, I pretty much had to set all of the systems to their lowest in-game graphics settings. And you can see here that even with the lowest in-game graphics settings, the 5560U is really struggling here, while the 5600H is at least giving us around a 30 FPS average, though you should expect some dips below 30 FPS here and there. It's certainly not a terrible experience, and we are at least able to do a full 1080p 30 FPS, but we are with the lowest in-game graphics settings. But you can see that the Ryzen 5 6600H is showing a nice improvement in both averages and 1% lows. And in general, it does actually end up being a very nice gaming experience across the board here. It really seems that with the Ryzen 5 5560U, you're just going to end up adjusting the resolution. Now specs wise across the board here, the 5560U is of course the weakest performer here, since it does have only a Radeon 6 iGPU with a maximum clock speed of 1600 megahertz. Now it's the same amount of cores as we have on the Ryzen 5 6600H's GPU, but of course going from Vega to RDNA 2 does make a very noticeable difference in terms of performance. You can see that core for core, we're pretty much looking at double the performance. Now it does make me very curious how the 680M actually ends up performing, since that is twice the amount of cores as we have on the Ryzen 5 6600H, but we'll have to take a look at that sometime later. But as it stands right now, if you're rocking a 5600H or a 6600H, you're going to be able to play the game at least 30 FPS average at the full 1080p resolution. But I would recommend that if you're rocking any version of the SRE5 mini PC in general, that you maybe drop down to 900p. It really seems like the Ryzen 5 6600H is the only one that will give you at least enough headroom that you can turn up some graphics settings and get a nice result. In general though, this franchise did prove to be pretty heavy on these little mini PCs. And by the way, if you're going to be playing the original game, you don't really need to run it at the ultra graphics settings. Going from ultra down to just high, you can see here that at the Ryzen 5 6600H, we are getting a more than comfortably above 60 FPS gaming experience, and I cannot visually tell the difference between high and ultra. I really already struggled to see the difference between normal and high, and the performance uplift that you get on this is actually pretty noticeable. Unfortunately, with the rest of the series, you are going to have to stick to around the medium to low graphics settings, but at least with the original game that started the reboot series, you're going to be able to max things out pretty comfortably. The only things you're not going to be able to really utilize are TressFX and maybe some of the more advanced post-processing effects that really have a huge impact on performance, but not really on the visuals. And this does have a pretty nice impact in terms of overall performance across the board on all systems here. Really though, if you you are on the Ryzen 5 6600H, I would recommend that maybe you just stick to the low graphics settings. You don't need to go down to the lowest. If you just stick with low for the rest of the franchise, you're going to have a pretty rock solid experience. Now, it's not going to be a high FPS experience, but you are going to be able to get the full 1080p resolution. And the thing I want you to pay attention to the most is those frame times. They are so incredibly consistent that your entire experience while you're playing the game is going to be rock solid. It's going to be very smooth, very consistent. And that's what you want. If you're not going to get a high FPS, you want a consistent FPS. Now, within reason, of course. A consistent 15 FPS is still, at the end of the day, 15 FPS. But we're already above 30, and we are not getting any major fluctuation in our FPS at all. That means we're getting a extremely playable experience here. And again, we don't have to mess with the resolution at all. And this also carries over into Shadow of the Tomb Raider, where you don't need to go to the very lowest graphic settings. You can set it to low. And I do recommend this because the lowest graphic settings does disable a lot of things, and it makes the game look really flat. If you just go with the lowest graphic setting, you're looking at maximizing your FPS, but it's really just going to make the game potato quality. I think that low is the ideal way to go. So you're going to be looking at a very similar above 30 FPS gaming experience. And again, look at those frame time charts. They are extremely smooth and extremely consistent, and that is the most ideal scenario possible. So with the Ryzen 5 6600H or above, you're going to be able to get a very rock solid experience out of this game. Now, if you're still rocking a system with a Vega based iGPU, you are going to have to start dropping your resolution. RDNA 2 is pretty much what is required to really get this to be a consistent above 30 FPS experience at the full 1080p resolution. But with Vega, dropping the resolution is your friend, especially if you're willing to go down to 720p. It can still hold up pretty well. But if you're interested in picking up any of these mini PCs, you can of course check out the Amazon affiliate links down below. I would really consider getting the SRE6 or the 6 Pro if you are looking to try to maximize a lot of these games. And what I mean by maximize is use the full 1080p resolution, because while a lot of these games you might only be able to play at the medium or the low graphics settings, you are at least getting the full 1080p resolution, and already that's going to make the whole experience great. And especially if you get 32 gigabytes of RAM, you can pretty much allocate like 8 gigabytes of RAM just to the GPU, and you'll never run out of RAM for pretty much any game out there. And being able to max out textures is really already a big step in terms of just getting games to look great. So even if you have all the effects turned off, if you have high resolution textures, it can already make a game look really, really nice. And that's not going to have a performance effect if you have enough VRAM. But in general, it does seem like this franchise is extremely playable on this system. But anyways, I will catch you guys in the next one.